Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate.
Member for Elmwood Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, I want to let you know I'll be splitting my time with the member for New Westminster Burnaby, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say once I conclude my remarks. I'm rising today to state my opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We could call it the CPTPP or whatever kind of window dressing Liberals want to add to pretend that it's not just the deal that was negotiated in secret by Conservatives, ultimately to be signed by them with no real meaningful changes. But I'm not going to do that because I have more respect for the intelligence of Canadians than apparently some others in the House, Mr. Speaker. So I'm going to call it the TPP. I just wanted to say at the outset that's something I'm doing on purpose, not by accident. And the reason why I oppose this deal, as I have opposed, and the NDP has opposed many trade deals in the past, is because it's a deal for the few and not the many. And that's the problem, Mr. Speaker. So there's a concept of trade in the Liberal Party and in the Conservative Party that's really just about corporations being able to use resources across countries to amass their own wealth, but that doesn't actually allow that wealth to be shared by workers in the countries that are a party to this agreement. And that's just as true for Canada as it is for many other countries. And that's why in the era of corporate globalization, under which these kinds of trade deals, not because all trade deals have to be this way, but because Liberal and Conservative governments in Canada have chosen to make them this way, that period of corporate globalization happens to coincide with, and if you look at the numbers, Mr. Speaker, what you'll see is that over that 25 or 30-year period, a growing and growing proportion of the wealth produced in those years, and we have seen GDP growth, and we have seen wealth increase. The problem is that that's not finding its way into the pockets of the workers that are producing that wealth. A larger and larger percentage of that wealth being generated is going into fewer and fewer hands, and we see a number of different, that's not the NDP making that claim. We've seen many different organizations track that information and report out on it. And so there is inequity built into these agreements. That's what we've been trying to highlight in today's debate, is the various mechanisms when you get into the content of the agreement and try and trace those mechanisms and what they actually mean for a Canadian worker in Canada, not just in terms of what the exports of the company they work for are going to be, but the wages that they're going to be paid once they're in unfair competition with workers in other countries that don't have the same standards under agreements that don't require some kind of meaningful reciprocity when it comes to labor standards. And likewise for the environment, Mr. Speaker. What happens to the environment in Canada if we're forced into competition with jurisdictions that don't have the same regulations, or what happens to the Canadian worker when the job leaves Canada because we've now given equal access to our markets to products made in countries that don't observe the same standards. So that's why I'm quite proud to stand in this place and say that I oppose this deal and the many deals like it. I look forward to the day, Mr. Speaker, when we have a trade deal that actually puts the interests of the Canadian worker first. I look forward to supporting that deal. But I don't think we're going to see it negotiated by the Liberals or Conservatives, at least not these iterations. The Liberals had opportunities to fix what was wrong with the TPP. They passed it up. And what we're hearing out of the NAFTA negotiation rounds is that they're getting ready to sell out Canadian workers in another international trade deal all over again, Mr. Speaker. So the track record over the last 25, 30 years just isn't there. And what they've done most recently doesn't show that they've learned any lessons from that past, Mr. Speaker. We talk about investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms, which is, a bit of a mouthful, but what does it mean for an ordinary Canadian? Well, what it means is that when you vote for a government that says we want to institute certain standards for the public good, whether it's an environmental standard or a labor standard, and not a Canadian company, because Canadian companies don't actually have the same rights under ISDS provisions as foreign companies, but a foreign company says that provision, maybe it's in the public interest, doesn't matter, it's going to cost me money. So I'm taking you to court, and I'm going to sue you, not just for my lost profits, although they get that too, but to also block the policy change. To add insult to injury, not only do we not get the policy that's in the public interest, but then we also have to pay the money for not getting the policy that's in the public interest. And Canada, on the world stage, is the biggest sucker for this kind of you know, for this kind of unfair treatment, let's say, Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve some of my more inflammatory characterizations of that for private conversation. But Canada, no doubt, has been the biggest sucker for this kind of treatment, Mr. Speaker. It's cost us more money than anybody else, and now we're lining up another 10 countries to be able to do that to us again, and it doesn't make sense. When we look at TPP and we ask ourselves questions about how it's going to benefit the Canadian worker, and we look at Chapter 12, Mr. Speaker, which is something that I've been up many times in the House and in committee talking about, there's nothing in there for the construction worker who's out of work right now. They talk about infrastructure investment and how they're going to put Canadians to work by investing in infrastructure on the one hand. With the other hand, they're off signing a deal that's going to make it far easier for international contractors to bring in temporary foreign workforces to perform that work when Canadians are out of work. There's no infrastructure to track those workers once they're in the country. There's no infrastructure to find out what they're being paid. There's no infrastructure to figure out whether or not their training is adequate or not or meets our safety standards. That's what's wrong with this agreement. So on the one hand, they're saying, well, we want to do this, we want to fix the temporary foreign worker program, we want to invest in infrastructure, it's all for Canadian workers. And on the other hand, they're off doing things that are actually going to make it easier for that work to get scooped by other workers, and it doesn't make sense. In terms of the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing, we see it again on the cost of pharmaceutical drugs, because the TPP, for as much as some of the worst provisions have been suspended, we know that they could come back at any time, and they're sitting there on the books waiting to drive up the cost of Canadian drugs, even as the government says they want to bring about some kind of drug insurance plan. We're not exactly sure it's going to be the right kind, but they're talking about trying to lower drug costs for Canadians, and then off on the trade file, there they go on their merry way, making it easier for the international pharmaceutical companies that produce those drugs to raise the price. Once again, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. That's the charitable interpretation, Mr. Speaker. Or it's that the voice for the left hand is just kind of being cynically put out there for political reasons, and the real hand of this government is the right hand. And that's why international corporations get provisions in the main agreement. And Canadian workers, if they get anything, get things in side agreements that aren't binding and don't mean anything and can be overwritten very easily, Mr. Speaker. So that's another measure of how serious the government is. Now, if some of the language in those side agreements, meaningful measures when it came to labor standards and environmental standards, actually made it into the trade agreement, because they are not in this agreement, then you would have a deal that the NDP could look seriously at and consider whether or not it was going to support it. Because that would mean that the government was actually trying to have a trade agreement that worked for Canadian workers instead of a handful of Canadian, what amounts to a handful, relatively speaking, of Canadian investors and business people who are looking to invest abroad and want to do it on their terms to make a big return. If they bring that money back to Canada and they don't send it off to Barbados or the Cayman Islands or wherever else they like to put their money, then that shows GDP is going up. And then the Liberals and Conservatives say, yay, we're increasing wealth. But if you follow the numbers, that wealth is not going to Canadian workers. That's why they're experiencing the highest levels of household debt that they have in generations. That's why they're finding it hard to find housing. That's why they're struggling to pay the cost of their drugs, because that wealth that's been created over the last 25 or 30 years under these kinds of trade deals, not trade deals writ large. And that's the problem, is that the Liberals and the Conservatives in this place conflate their idea of trade with trade generally speaking. There are different ways to trade. In fact, we trade already with many of the nations that are part of the TPP. And in fact, in many cases, there is hardly any tariffs on the trade happening between those countries. That's one way to trade. We've been trading that way. We can expand trade under that model, or we could do it under another kind of agreement that actually supports Canadian workers and supports employment for Canadian workers and actually recognizes the environmental impact of trading with certain nations that don't have the right standards. We could do that. That's still trade, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I think it's a better kind of trade, and it would be an effective kind of trade. That's the kind of trade the NDP supports. That's what we're fighting for, and it's why we're saying no to this agreement.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his very eloquent comments. I'd like him to come back to the issue of what this trade deal would actually do to communities across the country, both with the attacks on supply management that the government has refused to admit is happening within the agreement, but those of us in the NDP, we're the worker bees in this Parliament, Mr. Speaker. We've read through the agreement. We've actually found what the implications are, and we know that we're looking at losses of up to 60,000 jobs. So in terms of supply management, what that means for farmers and farming communities in the honourable member's province of Manitoba, and what it means in terms of industrial workers, particularly in the auto sector, those lost jobs. What does this mean, and why are the Liberals and Conservatives trying to ram this bill through rather than actually looking to fix all of the problems that are in this trade agreement?
For Elmwood Transcona.
Well, I thank you very much I thank the honourable member very much for his question. And I think one of the great virtues of supply management is that it has allowed farmers to get a fair price for their product. And when you do the comparison between Canadian prices and international prices, in fact, Canadian dairy products are priced competitively. But what it means is that we've actually been able to support smaller farms through dairy farming, as opposed to just having an expansion of the corporate model. That means a populated rural Canada. I mean, there's a downward trend there that we're always trying to fight, but one of the ways that we're going to fail in fighting that is by getting rid of supply management, which actually allows smaller farmers to be successful and to get a fair return for the work that they're putting in. In the U.S., who's encouraging us now to try and abandon our supply management system, you hear reports of dairy farmers in the United States that are going out of business, and in some cases, unfortunately, taking their life because they're not able to get a fair price for their product. And I think people are willing to pay a fair price for a fair product, and we shouldn't be adopting models that in their own countries clearly aren't working.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really want to thank my colleague for his very eloquent speech, and he expressed a lot of the frustration, I think, that we feel in the New Democratic Party when it comes to trade agreements, simply because, as my other colleague pointed out, we do our homework. We look at these agreements, we look at them from top to bottom, and we examine them, and we make sure that we're representing Canadians and their interests. And while the other side can sit and say the NDP is being anti-trade, do they say the same to the dairy farmers of Canada? Do they say the same to the building trades? Do they say the same to the Girl Guides and actually the librarians that were one of the 400 witnesses that we had before the Trade Committee? People came and expressed their legitimate concerns. They're not anti-trade. They said in this particular trade agreement, we have serious concerns with the provisions and the impacts that they'll have on our lives. New Democrats don't deny and try to gloss that over with some pretty language. We acknowledge the fact that real Canadians feel a real threat to their daily paycheck and to their very livelihoods. And that's something that it seems this Parliament is devoid of on both sides in the official opposition as well as the government. There's an absolute refusal to acknowledge how harmful this agreement will be to Canadians. And that does a disservice to trade. I believe that over the summer in NAFTA, we're having a conversation that we've never had in this country around trade. And that benefits all of us. To look at trade agreements in an in-depth manner, in a way that we haven't before, and challenge the way that we have been trading and the effectiveness of it. And my colleague did this very well. But I just want to speak to one particular point, the building trades. When the building trades came before the Trade Committee as one of our 400 witnesses, they said they weren't prepared to be before us because they have never been a part of a trade agreement before. And the government hadn't even informed them that they would be involved in a chapter in the agreement. So the building trades see a direct threat to their livelihood, and I wonder if the member could speak a bit to what he's heard from some key stakeholders out of the building trades on the CPTPP.
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona in 40 seconds or less, please.
Well, thank you very much to my colleague for the question. As she knows, I'm a construction electrician by trade and a proud member of the IBEW. And we already know of instances where, you know, international contractors are bringing in temporary workforces from outside the country, whether it's Ireland or elsewhere, to perform work when guys are at home down the street waiting for work. It's not fair. It was something that Liberals said that they wanted to fix when they were looking at the temporary foreign worker program, but again, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. So even as they say they're fixing the abuses of the TFW program, on the other hand, they're writing those very same abuses into the TPP, an internationally binding agreement. It makes no sense, and the building trades know that full well, Mr. Speaker.